Good afternoon. I would like to welcome everyone joining this afternoon's webinar. We are going to wait a couple more minutes for more folks to join in, and then we will get started. Okay, we are going to get started. More people may join as we go ahead, but we will move forward. I want to welcome you. My name is Marie Eagle. I'm the project coordinator for the ARC of Michigan, and I will welcome you to today's webinar on behalf of the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. Today's webinar is going to be a bit shorter than past webinars. We really just want to take a step back and present the data that we are using to inform this webinar series. So let me get going. Okay. So to begin with, this webinar purpose was to help inform the system of best practices and expectations to help improve person-centered planning across the state of Michigan. So to inform ourselves of what was needed in the way of training, we implemented a statewide systems needs assessment that began in October of 2020 and ran for about a month into November of 2020. So what we did was we sent this needs assessment out to people who work within the community mental health, behavioral health system around the state of Michigan. And we wanted to know from the system's perspective what training was needed and what was lacking. And so we're just going to go through the data that needs assessment gathered and how we're using it to inform what you're going to be seeing in the months coming. So this slide just reflects the different percentages of folks who did participate in the needs assessment. As you can see, a majority are case managers, clinical folks. The other is typically also someone who worked in the community mental health system, such as a self-determination coordinator, something like that. But all folks were people who are working in the community mental health system. So one of the things we wanted to know about was what kind of access did people feel like they had currently to training, both formal and informal. And so a majority of the people surveyed did feel like they strongly agreed that they had access to supervision or colleague support that they needed to do their job. And they also felt like they had access to the more formal training that they needed to do a good job. We were a little bit, there was a little bit concerned with the amount of folks who did either disagree or strongly disagree. But so that just supports our desire to have this ongoing consistent training. So we also wanted to see current barriers to ongoing training. And so barriers were that there were no trainers in the local area to be able to provide training, that they didn't find any available training helpful. Obviously, issues with staffing turnover, no time to complete trainings, and not able to bill for trainings. A lot of the other answers related to lack of consistency with available training. So depending on where you were, your person-centered planning training may be different from and other areas person-centered planning training. There was also some concern that the training available tended to focus on one particular set of of a population set instead of the one that maybe across population. So maybe just the IDD population, children's population, etc. So these are all things that we're going to be looking at going forward. Okay, so we also were very curious about the nature and frequency of current training. So, and again, this was completed at the end of last year. So the nature of the current formal training was mostly online and some still in person. And we expect that the mostly online trend will continue and will increase. And so these webinars will be done all virtually online and free of cost. The frequency of the current formal training, at least annually, with a little bit of quarterly or monthly. So we are going to, again, continue to hold these monthly. And then we looked at preferred method of training, and there really wasn't one winner in this area. Free online modules, webinars, guidance manuals, best practice tools, printable information, conferences, and opportunities for colleague discussions. So while we are going to look at a lot of these other areas, especially when it comes to best practice tools and printable information, we are going to primarily focus on this free version of the online module for the next year. So when we sent out this training needs assessment, I did a little pre-needs assessment with a much smaller subset of community mental health staff around the state. And we just did an open-ended survey to inform our survey to say, what do you think is needed? And these are all of the areas that we received responses to. And so when we sent out the statewide needs assessment, we included every single area that we received a response for something that training was needed in. And so as you can see, these covered everything from the basics of person-centered planning to different policy guidances, to meeting facilitation, understanding the Medicaid manual, home and community-based services rule, the available behavioral health service arrays, how to implement self-determined arrangements, coordination with schools, etc. So what we did with this information was once we compiled the data from the needs assessment, we focused on some priorities. And one of the things that we found that was very interesting was that there wasn't one necessarily, or even 2 or 3 areas that jumped out as very, very clear front runners. There were a few that didn't have much demand for them, but overall, which did make it very difficult to kind of determine what our priority was for this webinar series, that there was an equal amount of either strong need or moderate need noted for many of these topics. So what we did do was focus on the ones that received the highest weighted average. And so these 5 areas of topic need were the ones that received the highest weighted average from the survey. And so those are the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services self-determination policy guidance. Now, we did do a rollout of the new technical requirement in the fall. And in the next couple of months, the webinar series will be focusing on some more in-depth policy and technical requirement guidance. We also received high requests for the home and community-based services rules, some additional understanding of that. So as I go through these will be the focus areas for the coming months of this webinar series. There was also some high demand for the Michigan Medicaid programs. And that really boils down to understanding services available within the Medicaid programs, how to access those, etc., how to explain those to families. And so that's what we will be focusing on throughout the webinar series. How to assess medical necessity. That one received some pretty high marks. And then implementing self-determined arrangements. So those will be our focuses in the coming months, but this webinar series is not a strict year-long series. And so we are hoping to target every single topic that you saw on the previous slide in the coming years. And I do have more of this data available. I saw it in the chat, somebody asked for the data. I do have more of the actual numbers and data available, and I can pull a report for those of you who are interested. So also informing this webinar series is initial data that we are pulling from the PIHP site review process. And that data is being pulled from the interviews that are being held with individuals and family members currently receiving community mental health services across 3 different waivers. So that's currently the children's waiver, the SED waiver, and the habilitative support waiver. So that project began in July of 2019. And over on the left side of the screen, you can see all of the PIHP regions who have already been part of a site review that included the interview. Current fiscal year, we are working with the LRA, Macomb, and then SWMBA. And by the end of this fiscal year, we will have finished what I would consider phase 1. So every PIHP will have gone through a site review that included interviews with people receiving services. And so that's giving us our baseline data. I'm not going to share any data yet, any hard data, because it's very raw and we don't have a full complete data set. Once we have that in the fall, we will use it as a baseline to try to give a nice idea of where the system is currently focusing and where we're working. And so our hope is that moving forward with this webinar series, we are providing the technical assistance needed to help improve that person-centered planning for individuals and families. And so as we go into phase 2, which will begin in the summer or fall of 2021, we'll go back in for a second time. And our hope is then that we can see improvement in implementation of person-centered planning practices. And so while I'm not going to share specific data with you, I am going to share some initial data trends. So these are data trends and data points that across every PIHP region that we have been in, these are areas that we consistently see a need for improvement. Excuse me. And so these areas are independent facilitation. So that is both the understanding and the utilization of independent facilitation across the state of Michigan. This is consistently probably the lowest scoring across the regions of the standards that we're looking at. And so this will be a high priority. We also see some pretty big demand for some transition planning for youth transitioning out of younger services into more adult services. And there's a lot of rollover between some of these and some of what we saw in the needs assessment from the system. So again, information, understanding and access to the waivers that are out there and the specific waiver services. And in a real life sense, what this means is what we hear a lot during these interviews is we have no idea why we're on this waiver, what good it does us, and how this differs from someone who's not on it. Like, why am I on this waiver? And so trying to get information out there to help people understand what those waivers are and how they are to be used. Again, service arrays, and that was another point from the needs assessment. And so that is understanding what Medicaid services are available to folks, how do they access those, and how do they understand what they are. The next one is the home and community-based choice indicators. So we are really looking for quality measures when we do these interviews, and we look at the home and community-based services and the rules related to choice. And this one is a pretty low performer as well. And this often relates to things like choosing where they live, choosing who their roommate is, and choosing how people spend their lives, their daily lives. So this is another area that we're going to be focusing on. And we're also seeing some downward trends in people believing that their goals are person-centered and that they're created in a person-centered way. So what we often see is folks will report to us, well, I wanted to have this goal, but they said I had to have X goal because I'm on the HAB waiver, for example. So we're going to work on, and we already did one, kind of working on basic person-centered planning. So we're going to be working on creating actual person-centered goals. We also see some high reports of utilization of informal tools and assessments, things like the CIS, not necessarily used to inform the planning process, but sometimes used to dictate the planning process and amounts and scopes of services available to folks. So we did a session last month, I believe, on appropriate use of these planning tools to inform the process. And we will continue to focus on this moving forward because this is a pretty important area that I think the state needs some work on. And then again, with tying into the needs assessment, self-directed arrangements. So understanding and implementation of. So not only do we see across all PIHP systems a lack of understanding of what self-determination is, we also see a very inconsistent implementation of self-determined arrangements. And so this is an area that we will be focusing on fairly heavily moving forward. Okay, and so again, to repeat, the monthly webinar series is the third Tuesday of every month. They will be scheduled from 3 to 4. This month we had to reschedule, but typically this is exactly when they will be. So if you can hold your calendar, we do send out a Zoom webinar invite to a listserv. So if you do have someone who is not receiving that invitation, please email me at marie@arcmi.org and I will add them to the list. And that is really, in a nutshell, today's webinar. So I don't know if everyone is muted right now. Will be given access to the slides. Yes, this webinar will be recorded and the slides will be posted once about 2 days. I think I have an auto set so that 2 days after this webinar ends, everyone who participated will receive an auto email thanking them for participation. And in that email will be a link to the posted recording and this PowerPoint presentation. And that will be the normal monthly action that we take. So if anyone, again, very short and sweet this month, but if anyone does have any questions, they can be entered into the chat. Okay, I am having some questions for my emails. I'm just going to type it into the chat for you. And will I be announcing a schedule? Oh, I would love to announce a schedule. And that is going to be our hope is to get as many of these scheduled ahead of time as possible. But up to this point, it's really been dependent on who we can get, who's available for which topic at that moment. So hopefully as quickly as we can, we'll get that out. But I can't guarantee that there will be a consistently set schedule that I can get the presenter out to you guys. There's a question on just the self-directed arrangements, and I'm not quite certain what that is referencing. Well, I don't see any more questions. So if you did have any questions that we did not, who do you share results for PHP? At this point, the results are shared with the department. And the question was who we share the results for the PIHP site review interviews with. And again, this contract is with the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services as part of the site review process. And so that data is provided back to the department. And in full transparency, we've been developing this project as it started and continue to develop it. So we have a data analyst who started about a month ago who is diligently working to go through all of the past site review data and kind of come up with some really strategic and consistent tracks and trends that we can then share back with the system. So right now it goes back to the department shares it with the PAHPs. And from there, we are hoping to get some final reports that we can then share system-wide and across the state so everyone can see what that data indicates. What is the difference between HCBS choice indicators and self-directed arrangements? Oh, so HCBS is the Home and Community-Based Services Rule, which dictates things about choice and community when it comes to people receiving services within the mental health system. Self-directed arrangements are self-directed arrangements for people who are currently using the community mental health system to direct their own services to the degree that they choose. So very, very different projects. Self-directed arrangements are a local thing, and home and community-based services comes from a federal level. Okay, I don't see any additional questions. So if you do have any, my email was put into the chat. And again, a link to today's webinar and the PowerPoint will be sent. So thank you, everyone, and we hope to see you next month.